The November of 1891 brought with it one of those peculiar London fogs that seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence of its own. For 3 days it had settled over the city like a yellow shroud, transforming familiar streets into ghostly corridors where gas lamps struggled to pierce the gloom with their feeble amber glow. It was during this oppressive period that one of the most singular cases ever to cross the threshold of 221B Baker Street presented itself to my friend Sherlock Holmes. I had returned that evening from attending to a patient in Marylebone, a prosperous merchant whose nervous constitution had been severely tested by the recent fluctuations in the tea market. The fog had made the journey treacherous, and I was grateful to climb the familiar 17 steps to our lodgings, where I found Holmes engaged in one of his more peculiar domestic experiments. He had arranged a series of newspaper clippings in precise geometric patterns upon the carpet, occasionally adjusting their positions with the tip of his long index finger. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up, his keen ears having detected my approach despite the thick Persian rug beneath my feet. "Your patient's condition has deteriorated since your last visit, I perceive, though the crisis has passed. You prescribed laudanum for the immediate distress and recommended a temporary cessation of all business correspondence. The advice was received with considerable resistance. I had long since ceased to marvel at such demonstrations, though they never failed to provide a moment's entertainment. Quite correct on all points, Holmes. But how could you possibly— Your medical bag bears fresh scratches near the clasp, indicating repeated and hurried opening. The faint but unmistakable aroma of laudanum clings to your sleeve, where you evidently spilled a drop while measuring the dose. As for the correspondence, there are fragments of sealing wax upon your right cuff, red wax of the variety used by commercial establishments. The fragments are still soft, suggesting your patient crushed a letter in his agitation while you were present. Elementary observations, my dear fellow." He rose from his curious arrangement and moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to peer into the fog-shrouded street below. "But we have more pressing matters than the commercial anxieties of Marylebone merchants. Tell me, Watson, what do you make of this?" He handed me a letter written upon expensive cream-colored paper in an elegant feminine hand. The writing was steady, though I detected the faintest tremor in certain strokes that suggested considerable emotional strain held firmly in check. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street. Dear Sir, I write to you in a state of considerable distress regarding a phenomenon which defies all rational explanation. I'm not a woman given to flights of fancy, nor one whose judgment is easily clouded by grief, though I confess that the loss of my beloved husband some 18 months past has left me much changed. The matter concerns a portrait, a full-length oil painting of my late husband, Sir Reginald Pemberton, which hangs in the library of our estate in Richmond. For 3 consecutive nights, I have observed this portrait in positions markedly different from its original composition. On the first occasion, I attributed the change to a trick of lamplight or the fatigue of prolonged mourning. On the second, I began to question my own sanity. On the third night, last evening, I was forced to confront the impossible. The painted figure had not merely altered its pose, but appeared to have turned its head to gaze directly at me with an expression of such melancholy that I was compelled to flee the room. I've examined the canvas thoroughly. There are no signs of tampering, no evidence of substitution. The frame has not been disturbed, nor has anyone else in the household observed these changes. Yet I am certain as I am of my own existence, that the portrait moves. I implore you, Mr. Holmes, to investigate this matter with all possible haste. I fear not merely for my sanity, but for something far more precious, the memory of my dear husband, which these supernatural manifestations threaten to transform from a source of comfort into one of terror. Your servant, Lady Margaret Pemberton, Pemberton House, Richmond. I read the letter twice, feeling that familiar mixture of skepticism and intrigue that so often accompanied the initial presentation of Holmes's more unusual cases. A moving portrait, I said slowly. It sounds rather like something from a Gothic novel, Holmes. Surely there must be a rational explanation. Perhaps the lady's imagination, affected by grief and solitude. Holmes had returned to his position by the fire, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic attitude of deep contemplation. Your instinct toward rational explanation does you credit, Watson, though I note you leap to conclusions with admirable haste. Grief may indeed affect perception, but it rarely manufactures consistent, repeated observations of specific detail. Note that Lady Pemberton describes not vague supernatural manifestations, but precise alterations in pose and expression occurring over 3 consecutive nights. Then you believe there is something to this? I asked, settling into my armchair and reaching for my pipe. You think the portrait actually moves? I believe nothing yet, Holmes replied, his gray eyes gleaming with that peculiar light which indicated his mind was fully engaged. But I am intrigued by the precision of Lady Pemberton's observations and the evident struggle between her rational mind and the evidence of her senses. She takes care to establish her credibility and mental state, which suggests a woman of intelligence grappling with an impossible situation. He moved to his desk and began examining a railway timetable with characteristic intensity. Lady Margaret Pemberton, he murmured, as if testing the name. Widow of Sir Reginald Pemberton, the railway magnate. He died rather suddenly of heart failure, if memory serves, leaving her a considerable fortune and that grand estate in Richmond. There were no children from the marriage. And now she claims her late husband's portrait is moving, I observed. Could this be some manifestation of guilt or unresolved grief? Holmes turned from the timetable, and I saw that familiar gleam of intellectual excitement beginning to kindle in his eyes. Speculation without data is the cardinal sin of detection, Watson. However, I confess myself sufficiently intrigued by this impossible phenomenon to warrant immediate investigation. A portrait that moves, that changes expression, that gazes upon the living with melancholy. If such things occur with the regularity Lady Pemberton describes, we are dealing not with the supernatural, but with human intelligence of considerable ingenuity. You suspect deception, then? I suspect nothing yet, he replied, reaching for his coat. But I have learned that when the impossible occurs with such methodical precision, we are invariably confronting not the realm of spirits, but the far more dangerous territory of human ambition, greed, or revenge. Pack your bag, Watson. We leave for Richmond within the hour. Tonight? In this fog? Holmes's thin lips curved in that cold smile I'd come to know so well. Especially in this fog, my dear fellow. If someone is indeed manipulating Lady Pemberton's portrait for purposes yet unknown, they will not expect visitors on such a night, and I confess myself most curious to make the acquaintance of a painted gentleman who weeps and turns his head by lamplight. As I gathered my things, I could not shake the feeling that we were embarking upon one of those cases that would test not only Holmes's remarkable powers of observation and deduction, but our very understanding of what was possible in this rational world we thought we knew. The fog pressed against the windows of Baker Street like some living thing, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour with mournful insistence. Within the hour, we would be on our way to Richmond and Pemberton House, where a portrait waited in the darkness. A portrait that, if Lady Pemberton spoke truly, possessed the most unsettling characteristic of all, the ability to watch the living with painted eyes that held the sorrows of the dead. The hansom cab crawled through Richmond's fog-shrouded streets with agonizing deliberation, our driver navigating more by instinct than sight through the yellow murk that had transformed London's suburbs into a ghostly maze. Holmes sat in contemplative silence throughout the journey, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the feeble glow of a passing gas lamp. I knew better than to interrupt these periods of intense mental activity, for his mind was already ranging through the corridors of Pemberton House, arranging and rearranging the limited facts at our disposal. When we finally turned into the estate's gravel drive, the substantial Georgian facade of Pemberton House emerged from the mist like a great stone sentinel. Warm light glowed from several windows, suggesting a household still awake despite the late hour. Before we could announce ourselves, the door opened to reveal a tall, spare man of perhaps 60 years, whose dignified bearing marked him as the butler. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson?" he inquired, his cultured voice betraying subtle signs of strain beneath its professional composure. "I am Graves, the household butler. Lady Pemberton has been expecting you. Please do come in from this dreadful weather." The entrance hall was elegantly appointed, its walls adorned with family portraits and its floors covered with Turkish carpets that muffled our footsteps. Despite the interior warmth, there was something oppressive about the atmosphere, as though the fog had somehow penetrated the very walls. "Lady Pemberton awaits you in the drawing-room," Graves continued, taking our coats with practiced efficiency. "The household, I confess, has been considerably unsettled by recent events." "Then you are aware of the phenomenon concerning Sir Reginald's portrait?" Holmes asked sharply, fixing the butler with that penetrating gaze that so often discomfited those under his scrutiny. Graves hesitated for the briefest moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his weathered features. "I am aware that Lady Pemberton has been distressed, sir. As to the cause, I cannot speak with certainty. The portrait hangs in the library, which is Lady Pemberton's private domain." Before Holmes could pursue the matter further, a door opened and Lady Margaret Pemberton appeared. She was perhaps 40 years of age, handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair lightly touched with grey and intelligent eyes that held both strength and profound sorrow. Dressed in half-mourning purple silk, she moved toward us with evident relief, though I noticed her hands trembled slightly despite her composed bearing. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank heavens you have come," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion that colored it. "I'd feared the fog might delay you, and I confess I dreaded spending another night in this house without some rational explanation for what I have witnessed." She led us into a handsomely appointed drawing-room where a fire burned cheerfully in the grate. As we settled into comfortable chairs, Holmes leaned forward with characteristic intensity. "Lady Pemberton, your letter mentioned 3 consecutive nights of observations. I require you to describe each incident with the utmost precision, omitting no detail however trivial it may seem." She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, the knuckles white with tension. "It concerns my husband's portrait in the library, a full-length oil painting completed just months before his death. Until 3 nights ago, the figure stood in the same attitude I had always known, one hand resting upon a chair back, the other holding a folded newspaper, eyes directed slightly leftward toward a painted window. Her voice grew softer, more strained. On the first night, I went to the library shortly after 11, unable to sleep. When I lit the reading lamp and looked up, something felt wrong. Sir Reginald's hand, the one upon the chair, seemed to curve more tightly over the carved wood. So slight a change that I rebuked myself for folly. "And the second night?" Holmes prompted gently. I returned with the express intention of proving my imagination false. There was no doubt then. The fingers clutched the chair back with a force I had seen countless times in life when my husband was troubled. I rang for my maid, but she perceived nothing unusual. Lady Pemberton closed her eyes briefly. "The third night, last evening, when I entered the library, my husband's head had turned. Not greatly, but enough that his painted eyes met mine directly. Upon that canvas mouth was an expression of such sorrow as I had never seen there in life, as if he reproached me from beyond the grave." "You are certain no one has touched the painting?" Holmes asked. "Absolutely. The library remains locked. I carry the only key." She drew a small brass key from her waist chain. "Only Mr. Chislehurst, my steward, possesses another, for daytime use when servants must enter." Holmes rose abruptly, his eyes gleaming with that familiar light of intellectual excitement. Then let us make the acquaintance of this restless gentleman without delay. Lady Pemberton. The library, if you please." The hansom cab crawled through Richmond's fog-shrouded streets with agonizing deliberation, our driver navigating more by instinct than sight through the yellow murk that had transformed London's suburbs into a ghostly maze. When we finally turned into the estate's gravel drive, Pemberton House emerged from the mist like a great stone sentinel, warm light glowing from several windows despite the late hour. Graves, the household butler, received us with professional composure that barely concealed an underlying strain. His dignified bearing marked him as a man of long service, yet something in his manner suggested the recent disturbances had unsettled even his practiced calm. "Lady Pemberton awaits you in the drawing-room," he announced, taking our coats. "The household, I confess, has been considerably troubled by recent events." Lady Margaret Pemberton appeared moments later, a handsome woman of perhaps 40 years, dressed in half-mourning purple silk. Her intelligent eyes held both strength and profound sorrow, while her hands trembled slightly despite her composed bearing. "Thank heavens you have come," she said, leading us towards the library. "I had feared spending another night in this house, without some rational explanation for what I have witnessed." The library door stood at the corridor's end, fitted with a polished brass lock. Lady Pemberton produced a small key from her waist chain, her reluctance evident as the mechanism turned with a soft click. The heavy oak door swung inward, revealing a magnificent room that spoke of both wealth and genuine scholarship. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, their volumes arranged with meticulous care. A massive mahogany desk occupied one corner, while comfortable chairs flanked a cold fireplace. But it was the portrait above the mantelpiece that immediately commanded attention, a life-sized painting in a heavy gilt frame that dominated the room with remarkable presence. Sir Reginald Pemberton had been captured with exceptional skill. A man of perhaps 50 years, powerfully built, with iron-grey hair and penetrating dark eyes. He stood in formal evening dress, one hand resting upon an ornate chair back, the other holding a folded newspaper. Behind him, a painted window showed parkland bathed in afternoon light. Holmes approached with the focused intensity of a naturalist examining a rare specimen. He studied the canvas from various angles, occasionally consulting his magnifying glass, examining not only the painting itself, but the frame, the wall behind, the mantelpiece below, and even the floorboards directly in front. "Remarkable workmanship," he observed. "Who was the artist, Lady Pemberton?" "Mr. Cornelius Blackwood," she replied, her gaze fixed upon her late husband's painted features. "He came highly recommended by the Royal Academy. Sir Reginald sat for him over several weeks before his death." Holmes produced a tape measure, recording precise dimensions in his notebook with meticulous care. "Watson, your medical eye is often acute in matters of human expression. What do you observe in Sir Reginald's countenance?" I studied the painted features with professional attention. The artist has captured considerable force of character. The jaws firm, the bearing confident. Yet there is something in the eyes, a certain wariness, perhaps. Not the expression of a man entirely at peace. "Precisely," Holmes agreed. "Note how the hand grips the chair back, not merely resting but grasping with evident tension. This is not comfortable repose, but a man caught in considerable mental activity." Lady Pemberton watched with growing agitation. "But do you see what I described, Mr. Holmes? Has the pose altered?" Holmes turned to examine the heavy gilt frame, running his fingers along its edges before gripping the bottom corners and attempting to shift it. The frame held fast, immovable as the wall itself. "Bolted," he noted. "Standard practice for this weight. It has not been taken down recently." He dropped to his knees, directing lamplight onto the carpet, beneath the mantelpiece, crawling in a slow arc like a bloodhound on fresh scent. With tweezers, he retrieved a tiny, glittering speck, examining it against the light before depositing it into a small envelope. "A fragment of gold leaf, Watson, shed from the frame above. though its presence atop the carpet pile suggests it fell quite recently. Moving to the wall adjacent to the fireplace, Holmes ran his hand along the wainscoting. Suddenly, he froze, leaning in with his nose almost touching the dark wood paneling. "Watson, bring the light here." There, barely visible against the dark oak, was a faint vertical scratch, no longer than an inch, as if something sharp had grazed the wood. In the groove of the molding lay a fine dusting of white powder. "Fresh plaster, Watson," Holmes whispered, his eyes narrowing. "The portrait does not move. That is the deception. But something in this room moves, something requiring the wall to be disturbed." He straightened, his demeanor transforming from contemplative to alert. "We are finished here tonight, but I believe we must pay an early visit to your steward, Mr. Chislehurst. I have developed a sudden curiosity about his appreciation for the arts." Morning brought little relief from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Pemberton House. The fog had lifted sufficiently to reveal the estate's grounds, though grey clouds promised no respite from the gloom. I found Holmes already dressed and pacing before the breakfast-room windows, his sharp profile etched against the pale light. Lady Pemberton sat at the table, her untouched tea grown cold, dark circles beneath her eyes, testament to another sleepless night. "I trust the library remained undisturbed?" Holmes inquired without turning from his contemplation of the gardens. "I followed your instructions precisely," she replied, her voice strained. "The door remained locked, and I stationed Graves in the corridor until dawn. Yet I confess, Mr. Holmes, I could not escape the feeling that something watched me from behind that oak door." Holmes turned at last, his grey eyes holding that peculiar intensity that marked the opening moves of his mental chess game. "Fear is the criminal's most potent weapon, Lady Pemberton. Your tormentor relies upon your imagination to amplify his deception. We shall not grant him that satisfaction." The arrival of Mr. Alfred Chislehurst interrupted our conversation. The estate steward entered with his customary precision, yet I detected a subtle alteration in his demeanor. His movements, while maintaining their habitual economy, carried an underlying tension, like a violin string wound too tight. His pale eyes flickered between Holmes and Lady Pemberton with barely concealed anxiety. "Mr. Holmes," he said, executing a slight bow, "Lady Pemberton mentioned your continued presence. I trust you are finding our hospitality adequate." "Most illuminating," Holmes replied, studying the steward with the intensity of an entomologist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "I understand you manage the estate's financial affairs with considerable expertise." Chislehurst's hands tightened almost imperceptibly upon the leather portfolio he carried. "I endeavour to serve Lady Pemberton's interests with the same dedication I showed Sir Reginald." "Admirable loyalty," Holmes observed. "I should be grateful for an examination of the estate records. Lady Pemberton has granted me full authority in this matter." The colour drained from Chislehurst's already pale features. "The records? Surely such an examination is unnecessary. The estate's finances are in perfect order." "Then you will have no objection to demonstrating that order," Holmes replied smoothly. "Unless there is some impediment I am not aware of." Within the hour, we were seated in Chislehurst's meticulously organized office, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers that chronicled the Pemberton fortune in precise copperplate script. Holmes examined each volume with methodical thoroughness, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook while the steward watched with growing agitation. "Interesting," Holmes murmured, running his finger down a column of figures. Sir Reginald's investments were remarkably diverse: railways, shipping, mining ventures in South Africa. Yet here, 3 months before his death, several substantial dividend payments simply ceased. Chislehurst shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Market fluctuations, Mr. Holmes. Sir Reginald understood the risks inherent in speculative investments." "Doubtless," Holmes agreed, turning to another ledger. "And this entry here, a payment of £500 to one C.B., dated just weeks before the portrait's completion. Would that be Mr. Cornelius Blackwood?" The steward's response came too quickly, betraying his nervousness. The final commission payment, yes. Artists, as you know, can be quite demanding about their fees. Holmes closed the ledger with deliberate care, his eyes never leaving Chislehurst's face. £500 is an extraordinary sum for a portrait commission, even from a royal academician. Most curious that it was paid before the work's completion, rather than after. Sir Reginald was generous with those who served him well. Chislehurst stammered, but perspiration had appeared upon his upper lip despite the morning chill. Rising from his chair, Holmes moved to examine a smaller ledger that had remained unopened. As he reached for it, Chislehurst half rose, his hand extended as if to prevent the examination. "That contains only household accounts," he said quickly. "Surely of no interest to your investigation." Holmes's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "On the contrary, Mr. Chislehurst, I find that the smallest details often illuminate the largest deceptions." He opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the entries with practiced efficiency. How fascinating. Regular payments to a C. Blackwood extending back nearly 6 months before the portrait commission. Small amounts, but consistent, almost as if someone were providing a retainer for services yet to be rendered. The steward sank back into his chair, his face ashen. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot, and Mr. Chislehurst clearly understood that his careful house of cards was beginning to tremble. The tension in Chislehurst's office had become palpable, the steward's composure crumbling like ancient parchment beneath Holmes's relentless scrutiny. Perspiration beaded upon the man's pale forehead as he struggled to maintain his fabricated explanations, his hands trembling as they gripped the leather arms of his chair. 6 months of payments to Mr. Blackwood, Holmes continued, his voice carrying the inexorable weight of mathematical certainty. Small amounts, but consistent, almost as if you were maintaining him on retainer for services yet to be rendered. Most curious for an artist supposedly engaged only for a simple portrait commission. Chislehurst's voice cracked as he attempted another defense. Sir Reginald was particular about securing the finest talent. Mr. Blackwood required assurance of payment for his specialized materials. Rare pigments, canvas of exceptional quality. Specialized materials that cost £500 beyond the standard commission? Holmes's eyebrow arched with skeptical precision. "Mr. Chislehurst, you insult my intelligence. These payments originated from household accounts under your direct control, requiring no authorization from your employer. You were funding Mr. Blackwood privately, using Sir Reginald's money to do so." Before the steward could formulate another desperate explanation, rapid footsteps echoed in the corridor. Graves appeared at the doorway, his usually impeccable composure shattered by evident alarm. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the intrusion, but Lady Pemberton requires your immediate presence in the library. She says the matter is most urgent." We found Lady Pemberton standing before the portrait, her face drained of all color, one trembling hand pressed against her throat. The morning light streaming through the library windows illuminated the canvas with merciless clarity, revealing changes that defied all rational explanation. Sir Reginald's painted figure had undergone another transformation, more dramatic than any previous alteration. The melancholy expression had vanished entirely, replaced by unmistakable terror. His eyes, wide with apparent horror, stared not at the viewer but at some unseen threat beyond the canvas's edge. The hand that had previously gripped the chair back was now raised defensively, fingers splayed as if to ward off an approaching blow. "It changed during the night," Lady Pemberton whispered, her voice barely audible. Despite the locked door, despite Graves maintaining watch in the corridor, how is such a thing possible, Mr. Holmes? Holmes approached the portrait with renewed intensity, producing his magnifying glass and a narrow strip of paper marked with precise measurements. I recognized his methodical approach from the previous evening. He had recorded the exact positions of key elements within the composition. "Watson, observe closely," he instructed, holding the marked paper against the frame's edge. "The pupils have shifted significantly downward. The chin now sits a full 1/4 inch lower than before. The angle of the raised hand corresponds to no position we observed previously. He moved closer to the canvas, his keen eyes scanning every brushstroke with scientific precision. Suddenly, he knelt beside the mantelpiece, directing his pocket lamp into the narrow gap between frame and wall. "Most illuminating," he murmured, producing his tweezers to extract a tiny fragment from the crevice. "Fresh wood shavings, Watson. Someone has been adjusting the mounting mechanism quite recently." Rising, he examined the wainscoting with renewed interest, his fingers tracing an almost invisible seam in the dark oak paneling. "Lady Pemberton, during your husband's final months, did his behavior alter in any significant way? Did he seem troubled, perhaps fearful?" She sank into a nearby chair, her composure finally crumbling completely. He became obsessed with this room, spending hours staring at the portrait, muttering about debts and obligations. Toward the end, he spoke of being watched, of eyes that followed him even in darkness. He changed the locks himself, trusted no one else with access. And his relationship with Mr. Chislehurst during this period? Strained beyond recognition, she admitted. They had been close for years, but Sir Reginald began excluding him from all business discussions. He would not permit him into the library. Holmes turned to regard the steward who stood frozen in the doorway like a man witnessing his own execution. The color had drained entirely from Chislehurst's features, and his eyes held the desperate look of a cornered animal. "Mr. Chislehurst," Holmes said quietly, his tone carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Whatever arrangement you maintained with Mr. Blackwood, it has progressed far beyond simple financial irregularity. That portrait contains a message, a very specific message intended for very specific eyes." He moved toward the door with characteristic decisiveness. "We must locate Mr. Cornelius Blackwood immediately, Watson, for I suspect our elusive artist holds not merely the key to this mechanical deception, but to something far more sinister than a moving portrait. The game, as they say, is afoot." The journey back to London through the thinning fog provided Holmes with a contemplative silence he required to arrange the emerging facts into their proper configuration. Chislehurst's financial irregularities had revealed the existence of Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, but the true nature of their collaboration remained tantalizingly obscure. As our hansom navigated the familiar streets toward Bloomsbury, I observed that familiar tension in Holmes's bearing that indicated his mind was rapidly approaching some crucial revelation. The address extracted from Chislehurst's ledgers led us to a narrow building in Gower Street, where the respectable facade of Georgian brick concealed what proved to be a most extraordinary establishment. Blackwood's studio occupied the entire upper floor, accessible through a discreet side entrance that suggested the artist valued privacy above conventional respectability. Holmes's knock was answered by the man himself, a figure of perhaps 50 years, whose gaunt frame and paint-stained fingers marked him unmistakably as a practitioner of the artistic profession. Yet there was something in his pale eyes that spoke of interests extending far beyond the conventional boundaries of portraiture. "Mr. Cornelius Blackwood?" Holmes inquired, his voice carrying that deceptively casual tone that so often preceded his most devastating revelations. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We require discussion regarding your recent commission for the late Sir Reginald Pemberton." Blackwood's reaction was immediate and telling. The color drained from his already pale features, and his hands, steady enough to wield the finest brushes, began to tremble perceptibly. "I wondered when someone would come," he said quietly, stepping aside to admit us. "The moving portrait was always too ambitious, too prone to discovery." The studio itself defied every expectation I had formed of an artist's workshop. While the expected paraphernalia was present, easels, canvases, the familiar smell of turpentine and linseed oil, these conventional elements were overshadowed by an array of mechanical components that would have been more at home in a clockmaker's establishment. Delicate brass gears, springs of varying tensions, and lengths of wire, fine as human hair, lay arranged with scientific precision upon a workbench that dominated the room's center. Holmes approached this curious collection with the focused intensity of a naturalist examining a rare specimen. "Most ingenious," he murmured, lifting a tiny mechanism that combined clockwork precision with artistic sensibility. The gears are designed to operate behind a canvas, creating subtle movements through a system of nearly invisible wires. Blackwood watched our examination with growing resignation. "You understand the principle, then? The portrait was never intended as mere decoration, Mr. Holmes. It was engineered as an instrument of psychological manipulation." "Continue," Holmes commanded, his gray eyes fixed upon the artist, with predatory attention. The confession that followed revealed depths of human ingenuity applied to purposes most sinister. Blackwood had developed a revolutionary painting technique, employing flexible mediums that could accommodate mechanical movement without cracking or distortion. The portrait's apparent changes were achieved through an intricate system of counterweights and pulleys, concealed within the wall behind the frame, operated by controls hidden within the library's wainscoting. Sir Reginald commissioned the work himself, Blackwood admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He was convinced that his business dealings had marked him for supernatural retribution. The moving portrait was designed to reflect his deteriorating mental state, a mirror of his guilt made manifest. Holmes examined a series of preliminary sketches that showed Sir Reginald's face in various stages of anguish and terror. Yet the portrait continues to torment his widow, not the man who commissioned it. "Someone has assumed control of your mechanisms, Mr. Blackwood." The artist's composure crumbled entirely. "Chislehurst discovered the control system after Sir Reginald's death. He forced me to continue the deception, threatening exposure of my unconventional methods. But his purpose was not supernatural terror. It was thoroughly practical. He needed Lady Pemberton to abandon the library so he could search for Sir Reginald's final will." "Ah," Holmes breathed, his eyes lighting with that fierce satisfaction that marked the moment when scattered facts crystallized into perfect clarity. The new will that would have excluded him from Sir Reginald's estate, hidden somewhere within that locked library, beyond his reach as long as Lady Pemberton maintained her vigil. Holmes turned to me, his expression grave with newfound urgency. "We must return to Richmond immediately, Watson. Chislehurst believes his accomplice safely distant, the evidence of their collaboration destroyed. When he realizes we have uncovered his deception, desperation will drive him to direct action. Lady Pemberton stands between him and a fortune, a position of considerable peril." As we prepared to depart, taking Blackwood with us as witness to his own extraordinary confession, the fog seemed to thicken once more around London's streets, as if the city itself conspired to conceal the final act of this mechanical haunting. The return journey to Richmond was conducted with an urgency that bordered on reckless desperation. Holmes sat rigid in our carriage, his grey eyes fixed upon the darkening landscape with an intensity that spoke of genuine concern for Lady Pemberton's safety. The fog had begun to thicken once more, transforming the familiar countryside into a ghostly maze where danger might lurk behind any shadow. "Time is our enemy now, Watson," Holmes observed, consulting his pocket watch with mounting anxiety. "Chislehurst believes his accomplice safely distant in London, his deception undiscovered. When he realizes the full extent of our knowledge, desperation will drive him to actions far beyond his original intentions." Blackwood huddled in the corner opposite us, his earlier resignation giving way to genuine terror as the implications of his involvement became increasingly apparent. He was never meant to continue the deception after Sir Reginald's death, the artist whispered. The portrait was designed to torment a guilty conscience, not to drive an innocent woman to madness. Pemberton House emerged from the fog like a great stone monument to secrets and deception. The windows glowed with lamplight despite the early evening hour, and an unsettling silence pervaded the grounds. Most telling of all, the front door stood slightly ajar, a detail that sent Holmes springing from our carriage before it had fully stopped. Graves would never leave the door unattended, Holmes muttered, his hand moving instinctively toward the revolver concealed beneath his coat. Something has gone badly wrong. The entrance hall stood empty, but voices echoed from the direction of the library, Lady Pemberton's frightened tones intermingled with Chislehurst's increasingly agitated responses. Holmes moved with the silent efficiency of a predator, gesturing for Blackwood and myself to follow while maintaining absolute quiet. Through the partially open library door, we observed a scene of considerable disorder. Books had been pulled from shelves and scattered across the floor, their pages torn in frantic searching. The portrait above the mantelpiece hung askew, its frame damaged where someone had attempted to pry it from the wall. Lady Pemberton stood pressed against the far bookcase, her face pale with terror, while Chislehurst wielded a heavy brass candlestick with unmistakable menace. "The will must be here," the steward snarled, his usual composure completely shattered. Sir Reginald told me himself before his death that he had hidden his final testament in this accursed room. 20 years of faithful service, and he would have left me nothing but a pitiful pension while his fortune went to charitable foundations. Holmes stepped into the doorway with calculated authority, his voice cutting through the hysteria with cold precision. "Your faithful service, Mr. Chislehurst, consisted primarily of embezzling from your employer's accounts while maintaining an elaborate mechanical deception to drive his widow from the very room where evidence of your crimes lay hidden." The steward whirled to face us, the candlestick raised defensively. "Holmes, you understand nothing of what I endured, watching that fool squander a fortune on charitable endeavors while I received barely adequate compensation. The new will would have granted me nothing after decades of devotion." "So you hastened his death," Holmes stated with chilling certainty. Sir Reginald's heart condition was genuine, but his final attack was precipitated by more than natural causes. "What did you administer? Digitalis in excessive doses? Some preparation that mimicked cardiac failure while accelerating the inevitable?" Behind the steward, the portrait had begun another of its grotesque transformations. The painted face seemed to contort with mechanical precision, the eyes rolling back in apparent agony, the mouth stretching wide in a silent scream. It was the mechanism's final, most horrific performance, a masterpiece of engineered terror that had driven Lady Pemberton to the edge of sanity. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said quietly, never taking his eyes from Chislehurst. "The portrait performs its most elaborate deception yet. But note how our friend positions himself, never quite blocking the hidden panel in the wainscoting where the controls lie concealed." With deliberate movements, Holmes began circling toward the fireplace, forcing Chislehurst to turn and reveal the mechanism's location. "The game is finished, Chislehurst. Your accomplice has confessed everything. The mechanical apparatus, the financial irregularities, the systematic torment of an innocent woman, all documented and witnessed." Desperation transformed the steward's features into something barely human. With a cry of rage and frustration, he raised the candlestick and lunged forward, no longer caring whether his target was Holmes or Lady Pemberton. The final act of this mechanical nightmare had begun, and only swift action would prevent it from ending in genuine tragedy. The attack came with desperate fury, but Holmes had read the signs of Chislehurst's deteriorating composure with that uncanny precision that marked his finest analytical moments. As the heavy brass candlestick descended in a murderous arc, Holmes stepped aside with practiced efficiency, his left hand simultaneously seizing the steward's wrist and redirecting the blow toward the carved mantelpiece. The weapon struck the ornate woodwork with a resounding crack, sending fragments scattering across the hearth. The impact threw Chislehurst off balance, and I moved instinctively to intercept him, my service revolver drawn and leveled with military precision. Years of Afghan campaigns had left certain reflexes intact, and the familiar weight of the weapon in my hand brought immediate calm to the chaotic scene. "It's finished, Chislehurst," I declared firmly, positioning myself between the steward and Lady Pemberton. "Drop any thoughts of further violence and step away from her ladyship." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the steward stood frozen between desperation and resignation, his chest heaving with exertion and terror. Then, with a sound that fell somewhere between a sob and a bitter laugh, he allowed his shoulders to sag as the full weight of his exposure settled upon him like a physical burden. Holmes moved immediately to Lady Pemberton, guiding her gently to a chair while maintaining vigilant observation of our captive. "You are quite safe now, Lady Pemberton. The supernatural manifestations that have plagued you were merely the products of human ingenuity applied to criminal purpose." At that moment, Graves appeared in the doorway, his usual composure restored, though his face remained pale with concern. "I took the liberty of dispatching a footman to summon the constabulary when I heard the disturbance, Mr. Holmes. They should arrive presently." "Excellent foresight, Graves," Holmes replied approvingly. "Your assistance in restraining our friend here would be most welcome." With the butler's help, we secured Chislehurst's arms behind his back using a curtain cord, the man offering no further resistance as the fight seemed to drain from him completely. Holmes then turned his attention to the portrait, approaching it with renewed purpose now that immediate danger had passed. His fingers traced the frame's ornate gilt work until they found a barely perceptible catch concealed within the decorative molding. With a soft click, a section of the wainscoting below swung outward, revealing a narrow cavity containing the most intricate system of mechanical components I had ever witnessed outside a clockmaker's workshop. "Remarkable craftsmanship," Holmes observed, gesturing for Blackwood to approach. "Explain your masterpiece, sir." The artist stepped forward with evident reluctance, his expression mixing shame with reluctant professional pride. The canvas is mounted on a flexible backing, supported by a system of 23 separate actuators controlled through wires running within the wall cavity. Each mechanism can alter tension across specific areas of the painting: the mouth, the eyes, the position of the hands. By manipulating these brass levers in sequence, one can create the illusion of progressive emotional change with remarkable precision. Holmes nodded, his attention now focused on the cavity's deeper recesses. Behind the mechanical apparatus, partially concealed by the clockwork components, lay a leather document case bearing Sir Reginald's monogram in faded gold. He extracted it with careful reverence, brushing away accumulated dust before opening the brass clasp. Within lay several documents, the topmost being a last will and testament dated just 3 weeks before Sir Reginald's death. Holmes scanned the contents with rapid efficiency, his eyebrows rising slightly as he absorbed the implications. "Most illuminating," he murmured, handing the document to Lady Pemberton. Sir Reginald had indeed prepared a new will, one that excluded Mr. Chislehurst entirely from any bequest beyond a modest pension. The bulk of the estate was designated for charitable foundations supporting railway workers and their families, a final act of conscience from a man who had built his fortune upon their labor. Lady Pemberton accepted the document with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as she read her late husband's final wishes. "He knew," she whispered. "He discovered the embezzlement and understood the danger. That is why he changed the locks, why he trusted no one with access to this room." The revelation seemed to break the last of Chislehurst's resistance. He collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of complete defeat. "He confronted me 3 weeks before his death," the steward confessed, his words barely audible. "Said he had evidence of my irregularities, threatened exposure and prosecution unless I made full restitution. But 20 years of careful theft had left me with nothing. I had gambled it all away, every penny stolen over the decades." Holmes regarded him with clinical interest. "So you administered the digitalis, a substance readily available in any household medicine cabinet, easily disguised in his evening brandy." Sir Reginald's weakened heart could not withstand the excessive dose, and his death appeared entirely natural, the inevitable conclusion of long-standing cardiac disease. The steward's silence confirmed the accusation more eloquently than any verbal confession. At that moment, the sound of approaching hooves and official voices announced the arrival of the local constabulary, their lanterns casting dancing shadows through the fog-laden windows. As the police took Chislehurst into custody, Holmes led us back to the drawing-room where Lady Pemberton's staff had prepared tea with admirable efficiency despite the evening's dramatic events. The fog outside had finally begun to lift, revealing a clear night sky where stars shone with cold brilliance. "A remarkable case, Holmes," I observed, settling into a comfortable chair and accepting the welcome warmth of the teacup. "To think that a painting could be made to move with such mechanical precision." Holmes filled his pipe with deliberate care, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight with characteristic intensity. "Human ingenuity knows few bounds when motivated by greed or guilt, Watson. The portrait was merely a sophisticated tool, a mechanical mirror reflecting the desires and fears of those who gazed upon it. Sir Reginald saw his own deteriorating conscience. Lady Pemberton saw her grief transformed into terror. Chislehurst saw an obstacle to his criminal ambitions. He struck a match, watching the flame dance before applying it to his tobacco. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this case lies in its psychological dimensions. Chislehurst was so consumed by his search for the will that he failed to recognize the portrait's true message, that Sir Reginald knew everything. The painted eyes that seemed to watch him search were not supernatural, but they were undeniably judgmental. Lady Pemberton, though still shaken by the evening's revelations, managed a faint but genuine smile. "I shall have the mechanism removed, Mr. Holmes, but perhaps I shall keep the portrait itself. Once restored to its original state, it may serve as a reminder that even the most terrifying mysteries have rational explanations rooted in human nature." "A most wise decision," Holmes agreed, rising and consulting his pocket watch. "And now, Watson, I believe the last train to London departs within the hour." I confess myself suddenly eager for the familiar chaos of Baker Street, where the only mysteries we face are those brought to us by living clients, not by painted gentlemen with mechanical souls and clockwork consciences. As we departed Pemberton House, the moon had risen fully above the dissipating fog, casting long, peaceful shadows across the estate's manicured grounds. The great house stood silent and serene once more, its secrets finally exposed, its mechanical phantoms laid permanently to rest in the cold light of human reason and justice. The journey back to London provided a welcome respite from the evening's dramatic revelations, though the weight of what we had witnessed at Pemberton House lingered heavily upon my mind. Holmes sat opposite me in our first-class compartment, the rhythmic clatter of wheels upon rails accompanying his contemplative silence. Through the window, the fog that had shrouded Richmond for days was finally lifting, revealing a countryside bathed in clear moonlight that transformed the familiar landscape into something approaching ethereal beauty. "You appear troubled, Watson," Holmes observed, breaking his reverie as we passed through the outskirts of the city. "Surely the resolution of such an intricate case should bring satisfaction rather than melancholy." I set aside the evening newspaper that had failed to hold my attention. "I confess myself disturbed by the depths of human deception we have witnessed, Holmes. 20 years of faithful service transformed into systematic theft and ultimately murder. What drives a man to such extremes?" Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. "The same forces that have corrupted men since time immemorial. Greed, resentment, and the corrosive belief that one's efforts deserve greater reward than circumstances provide. Chislehurst convinced himself that his service entitled him to Sir Reginald's fortune, that charitable bequests represented personal affronts to his dedication. Yet you suspected him from the very beginning," I observed. "Your certainty seemed almost supernatural in itself." Holmes's thin lips curved in that familiar expression of intellectual satisfaction. "Consider the evidence, my dear fellow. Lady Pemberton's letter described changes occurring with mathematical precision across consecutive nights. A hysterical imagination rarely exhibits such consistency. When the impossible occurs with clockwork regularity, one must always look for the clockmaker." He leaned forward, his grey eyes gleaming with renewed intensity. The physical evidence confirmed my suspicions immediately. That flake of gold leaf upon the carpet indicated friction against the frame. Mechanical movement, not supernatural manifestation. The fresh scratch upon the wainscoting suggested a sliding panel, characteristic of concealed mechanisms. Most telling of all were Chislehurst's financial records, regular payments to CB, predating the portrait commission by months. Why maintain an artist on retainer unless the work required ongoing technical maintenance? The train began its final approach to Paddington Station, familiar landmarks emerging from the darkness like old friends welcoming us home. I found myself contemplating the human elements that had transformed mechanical ingenuity into instruments of psychological torture. The portrait's original purpose was confession rather than deception. Holmes continued, knocking the dottle from his pipe. Sir Reginald commissioned Blackwood's mechanism as a mirror of his deteriorating mental state, guilt made manifest through brass gears and tensioned wire. Only after his death did Chislehurst corrupt this artistic expression into a tool of terror. "What will become of Blackwood?" I inquired. "Surely his cooperation warrants consideration." "His testimony will prove essential in securing Chislehurst's conviction," Holmes replied. "The courts will recognize the distinction between artistic innovation and deliberate malice. Blackwood was coerced into continuing the deception, threatened with exposure of methods that, while unconventional, were not inherently criminal." As our hansom navigated the familiar streets toward Baker Street, I reflected upon Lady Pemberton's remarkable resilience. The terror that had consumed her for days had vanished, replaced by profound sorrow tempered with relief. The betrayal by a trusted servant would require time to heal, yet she possessed a strength that would serve her well. "You will record this case for publication?" Holmes asked as we climbed the 17 steps to our lodgings. "If you have no objection," I replied, though I confess uncertainty about presenting the mechanical aspects comprehensibly. Holmes smiled faintly as Mrs. Hudson greeted us with evident relief. "Then simplify, Watson. Focus upon the human drama rather than engineering specifications. Tell them of a portrait that moved, a widow tormented, and a steward whose greed led to mechanical deception and murder. Your readers seek moral instruction, not treatises on clockwork mechanisms." Settling into his familiar armchair before our cheerful fire, Holmes reached for his tobacco with characteristic precision. A singular case indeed, demonstrating that the most bizarre and apparently supernatural crimes are invariably the most susceptible to logical analysis. The more outré the features, the less mysterious the cause. As the wind rattled our window panes and London settled into peaceful slumber around us, I contemplated the darkness we had confronted, not the supernatural terror that Lady Pemberton had feared, but the far more chilling reality of human hearts consumed by avarice and betrayal. The portrait that moved had indeed caught a thief, though not quite in the manner Sir Reginald had envisioned when he first commissioned that remarkable mechanical confession. The days following our return from Richmond brought a welcome restoration of normalcy to Baker Street, though the peculiar case of the moving portrait continued to occupy my thoughts with unusual persistence. Holmes had resumed his customary routine of chemical experiments and correspondence, yet I observed him occasionally pausing in his work to stare thoughtfully at some invisible point, his keen mind evidently still turning over the psychological complexities we had encountered at Pemberton House. On the third morning after our adventure, Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of a telegram bearing the familiar Richmond postmark. Holmes accepted it with characteristic nonchalance, though I detected the slight quickening of interest that marked his continued investment in the case's aftermath. "Lady Pemberton writes with considerable composure," he observed, passing me the yellow paper. "The mechanical apparatus has been completely dismantled under Mr. Blackwood's supervision, and the portrait restored to its original stationary condition. Chislehurst awaits trial, his confession having provided prosecutors with overwhelming evidence of both embezzlement and attempted murder." I read the telegram with satisfaction, noting the restored strength in Lady Pemberton's prose. The terror that had consumed her for those dreadful nights had been replaced by a dignified resolve to rebuild her life free from the shadows of mechanical deception. "She mentions an interesting detail," I observed. "The portrait will remain in the library, but she intends to commission a companion piece, a landscape to hang opposite Sir Reginald's likeness. She writes that the room should contain beauty that moves only in the imagination, not through brass gears and hidden mechanisms." Holmes smiled with genuine warmth, a rare expression that transformed his usually austere features. "A wise decision, Watson. She understands that the antidote to artificial terror is authentic human creativity. The library will become a place of genuine contemplation rather than mechanical manipulation." He moved to the window, gazing down at the familiar bustle of Baker Street where ordinary people pursued ordinary lives, blissfully unaware of the extraordinary dramas that unfolded behind the facades of respectable establishments. "The case presents several elements worthy of deeper consideration," he continued. "We witnessed the perversion of artistic genius for criminal purposes, the psychological exploitation of grief, and the ultimate self-destruction that accompanies elaborate deception." "You speak as if Chislehurst's downfall was inevitable," I remarked, settling into my chair with the morning papers. "All complex crimes contain the seeds of their own exposure, Watson. Chislehurst's fatal error lay in overestimating his control of the situation. He believed himself the puppet master, manipulating Lady Pemberton's fears through mechanical precision. Yet every operation of those hidden mechanisms created fresh evidence of human intervention: the gold leaf, the scratched wainscoting, the disturbed plaster. His very success in terrorizing his victim provided the clues that led to his capture." Holmes returned to his chemical apparatus, adjusting the flame beneath a bubbling retort with practiced precision. Sir Reginald's original conception was far more sophisticated than his steward understood. The portrait was designed as a private confession, a mechanical mirror reflecting the deterioration of a guilty conscience. When Chislehurst appropriated this intimate expression for his own criminal purposes, he transformed art into mere trickery, a degradation that inevitably led to exposure. The philosophical implications of the case continued to fascinate me as I considered the intersection of human psychology with mechanical innovation. "Do you believe Sir Reginald anticipated his steward's betrayal?" I asked. Holmes paused in his work, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar light which indicated deep analytical thought. "I suspect he understood Chislehurst's character far better than the man understood himself. The new will, the hidden location, the mechanical apparatus, all suggest a mind preparing for posthumous revelation. Sir Reginald may not have predicted the exact sequence of events, but he certainly created conditions that would expose his steward's true nature." A knock at our door interrupted this fascinating discussion. Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, whose weathered features bore the satisfied expression of a man whose cases were proceeding smoothly through the judicial system. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." He greeted us with unusual warmth. "I've come to report that Chislehurst's trial date has been set for next month. His confession, combined with Mr. Blackwood's testimony and the financial evidence, should ensure a swift conviction. The man seems to have abandoned all hope of defense, spending his time in custody writing what he calls his complete confession, apparently a detailed account of 20 years' worth of embezzlement." "Guilt seeks expression, Lestrade," Holmes observed. "Having lived with deception for decades, Chislehurst may find genuine relief in complete honesty, however belated." The inspector consulted his notebook with professional satisfaction. Lady Pemberton has also indicated her intention to establish a foundation for the support of domestic servants in financial distress. A charitable endeavor inspired, she says, by her desire to prevent others from following Chislehurst's path of desperation and crime. As Lestrade departed, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable transformation that had occurred within the span of a few days. Terror had given way to understanding, supernatural fear to mechanical explanation, and criminal triumph to inevitable justice. Yet perhaps most significantly, Lady Pemberton had emerged from her ordeal not as a victim, but as a woman determined to create positive change from negative experience. "You will record this case for publication?" Holmes inquired, settling into his armchair with his pipe. "If you approve," I replied, though I confess uncertainty about how to present the mechanical aspects without losing the human drama that makes the story compelling. Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. "Focus upon the psychology, Watson. Your readers seek understanding of human nature, not engineering treatises. Show them how guilt can drive a man to commission his own mechanical confessor, how greed can corrupt 20 years of faithful service, and how terror can be manufactured through the perversion of artistic genius. The clockwork is merely the stage machinery. The real drama lies in the human hearts that set it in motion." As evening approached and the gas lamps began to flicker to life along Baker Street, I opened my notebook and began to write, knowing that this singular case would take its place among our most memorable adventures. Not for its supernatural elements, which proved entirely artificial, but for its demonstration of the complex machinery of human motivation that drives both criminal ambition and ultimate justice. The weeks following Chislehurst's conviction brought a peculiar tranquility to Baker Street, though I observed Holmes occasionally pausing in his experiments to stare thoughtfully into the fire, his keen mind evidently still turning over the psychological complexities we had encountered at Pemberton House. The case had generated considerable interest throughout London's artistic and scientific communities, with numerous inquiries arriving daily regarding Blackwood's mechanical innovations. On a particularly grey December afternoon, as snow began to dust the windowsills, Holmes sat surrounded by correspondence relating to the case. His expression carried that mixture of satisfaction and mild philosophical contemplation that typically accompanied the resolution of his more intricate investigations. "The public imagination is a curious thing, Watson," he observed, setting aside yet another letter requesting technical details. "We expose a straightforward case of embezzlement and murder, yet society fixates upon the clockwork mechanisms rather than the human motivations that gave them purpose." I looked up from my own writing, where I had been struggling to balance technical accuracy with readable narrative. "Perhaps people find comfort in mechanical explanations, Holmes. A portrait moved by brass gears is less disturbing than one driven by decades of accumulated resentment and betrayal." Holmes considered this with thoughtful attention, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "We are all portraits, Watson, painted over canvas that hides the true machinery beneath. Society sees the varnish, the careful brushstrokes of civility and custom. But the detective's task is to look past the paint, to find the hidden gears, the greed, the fear, the jealousy that actually drive the figure." The afternoon post brought a thick envelope bearing Lady Pemberton's familiar handwriting. Holmes opened it with evident interest, extracting several pages accompanied by a smaller, sealed letter and a carefully wrapped object. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, scanning the contents. "Lady Pemberton has completed her examination of Sir Reginald's private papers and discovered a journal documenting not only his growing awareness of Chislehurst's embezzlement, but the true purpose of Blackwood's mechanical apparatus." He passed me several pages, allowing me to read Lady Pemberton's elegant prose describing her late husband's tortured conscience. The journal revealed that Sir Reginald had commissioned the moving portrait as a form of private penance, using the hidden controls to manipulate the painted features during his solitary evening hours, transforming the canvas into a mechanical mirror of his deteriorating mental state. She includes a particularly poignant entry from 3 weeks before his death, Holmes continued, reading directly from the journal. Sir Reginald writes, "The portrait watches me now with accusing eyes, though I know the mechanism operates only through my own manipulation. Yet is this not the essence of conscience, that we torment ourselves with our own guilt, creating phantoms that exist nowhere but in our troubled minds?" The philosophical depth of this revelation struck me forcefully. Then Sir Reginald was both creator and victim of his own mechanical confessor. Precisely, Watson. Blackwood designed the apparatus with dual controls, one set for Sir Reginald's private use, another that Chislehurst discovered after his employer's death. What began as intimate self-examination became public terror when appropriated for criminal purposes. Holmes unwrapped the smaller object, revealing a charcoal sketch of remarkable skill. It depicted the library at Pemberton House transformed, curtains drawn back to reveal sunlight streaming across the floor, the space above the mantelpiece now occupied by a serene landscape rather than the tormented portrait. "From Mr. Blackwood," Holmes explained, consulting the letter. He requested permission to create this sketch before his departure for the continent, wishing to capture the room not as a chamber of horrors, but as it might be, peaceful, illuminated, and free of mechanical ghosts. I examined the drawing with growing appreciation for its symbolic significance. And the portrait itself? Rehung in the gallery, stripped of its mechanisms and restored to simple canvas and oil. Lady Pemberton writes that she now understands its true meaning, not as supernatural torment, but as a poignant monument to human conscience and regret. She has chosen to preserve it as Sir Reginald created it, a permanent reminder that guilt finds expression through whatever means the troubled soul can devise. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered street with an expression I recognized, the restless hunger for new mental challenges that no amount of philosophical reflection could entirely satisfy. So ends the case of the moving portrait, Watson. A singular mixture of the medieval and the modern, Gothic haunting achieved through industrial engineering. It serves as a reminder that in this age of steam and science, the oldest crimes simply find new methods of expression. As if summoned by his words, a carriage appeared through the swirling snow, slowing before our door. Holmes turned from the window, his eyes lighting with that familiar, predatory gleam. "Put away your manuscript, Watson," he said, a smile touching his thin lips. "The portrait is finished, but unless I am very much mistaken, a fresh canvas is about to be placed upon the easel." The visitor who interrupted our contemplative afternoon brought with him not merely the sharp scent of winter air, but an urgency that spoke of fresh mysteries demanding immediate attention. Yet as Holmes gestured toward the client's chair, he paused with uncharacteristic deliberation, his gray eyes holding an unusual warmth as they fell upon my scattered manuscript pages. "A moment, if you please," Holmes said quietly, raising one hand toward our anxious guest. "Watson, before we embark upon fresh investigations, our previous case deserves proper conclusion. You have been recording the Pemberton affair for publication?" I nodded, indicating the pages spread across my writing desk. I've attempted to balance the mechanical ingenuity with the human tragedy, though the philosophical implications continue to challenge my narrative approach. Holmes moved to examine my work, his keen eyes scanning the text with professional interest. "You have captured the essential elements, Watson, but perhaps you might conclude with an observation that has occurred to me during these weeks of reflection." He selected his words with careful precision. The portrait that moved was never truly about canvas, oils, or brass mechanisms hidden behind oak panels. It concerned perception itself, how we see ourselves, how others see us, and how those visions can be manipulated through fear, guilt, or grief. He returned to his armchair, his expression thoughtful, yet alert. Sir Reginald commissioned a mechanical mirror to reflect his deteriorating conscience. Chislehurst appropriated it to manufacture terror. Lady Pemberton perceived in its changing features the supernatural judgment she feared her grief had earned. Yet the portrait itself remained constant, merely paint upon canvas, inert and innocent. The true movement occurred not in the frame, but in the hearts of those who gazed upon it. Our visitor shifted impatiently, and Holmes immediately directed his full attention to the young man who had climbed our stairs with such evident distress. He was perhaps 25 years of age, well-dressed but bearing the unmistakable signs of recent shock: pale complexion, trembling hands, and the distinctive ink stains of one employed in the printing trade. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the young man inquired, removing his hat with hands that shook despite his effort at composure. "My name is Edmund Carstairs of Lincoln's Inn. Inspector Lestrade suggested you might assist with a matter that has left both the police and my senior partners thoroughly baffled." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest as he conducted his characteristic visual examination. "You come directly from Fleet Street, having abandoned your usual caution to seek consultation without your partner's knowledge. The decision was made hastily, prompted by some disturbing discovery in your professional capacity." Carstairs stared in amazement. "Perfectly correct, sir, but how could you possibly— The ink upon your cuff is fresh and of the specific composition used in legal documentation. Your boots bear traces of the distinctive grey mud from the construction works near the Royal Courts of Justice, yet you have clearly made a detour through the newspaper district. The aroma of hot lead and damp paper clings to your overcoat. You are connected to the legal profession, but have recently consulted the press regarding some urgent matter." Holmes gestured toward the brandy decanter. "Watson, our visitor requires restoration. The cold has affected him less than the shock of whatever discovery prompted this hasty journey." As I administered the restorative, Carstairs produced a grey envelope from his inner pocket. "This arrived at my chambers 2 hours ago, Mr. Holmes. There was no signature, no return address, merely my name written in an unfamiliar hand. We have represented certain interests connected to the Pemberton estate for nearly 3 generations." Holmes's eyes gleamed with renewed intensity. "Ah, the ripples from Richmond continue to spread, it seems. Pray continue, Mr. Carstairs." The young solicitor unfolded a single sheet bearing cramped, agitated writing. The message is both threatening and cryptic. The portrait secrets were merely the surface. Deeper truths await discovery in the mining records of 1873. Until the full accounting is made, the dead shall not rest. Look beyond the railways to the tunnels where men died in darkness, and their blood blackened more than one set of hands. Holmes examined the document with his magnifying glass, noting paper quality, ink composition, and handwriting characteristics. No watermark, common stationery, but the script belongs to someone accustomed to ledgers and legal forms. Recent illness or considerable agitation accounts for the tremor, yet the fundamental training remains evident. I observed the familiar transformation overtaking my friend. The philosophical dreamer replaced by the man of action, the hound straining at the leash of intellectual pursuit. The snowy afternoon that had promised peaceful reflection now beckoned with fresh mysteries and genuine danger. Holmes rose with characteristic decisiveness. "Mr. Carstairs, you have done wisely to bring this matter directly to me rather than to the sensational press. Truth is indeed a dangerous substance, requiring careful administration." He moved toward his coat with predatory grace. "We shall examine your correspondence allegations thoroughly, but in our own fashion and according to our own methods." As we prepared to venture once more into London's fog-shrouded streets, I reflected upon the extraordinary journey from mechanical phantoms to human reality that had characterized the Pemberton case. The portrait hung now in peaceful stillness, its mechanisms dismantled, its painted features frozen in Sir Reginald's chosen expression of eternal contemplation. Yet somewhere in the city's labyrinthine depths, fresh secrets awaited discovery, and the game, as Holmes would say, was once again afoot.